Hey guys, Nick from ArchCityPLO.com and Arch City Poker. Today's video, it's going to be a step-by-step video for you YouTube subscribers, your monthly step-by-step video that I told you I would deliver on. And the topic of this step-by-step video, sorry for the cat if you heard him, is going to be essentially adjusting in-game. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this and show this hand that I played is that you don't have to be so rigid within the system. Yes, I think these four thoughts should always be in your mind every hand. That's the point of the system, is to help you guys be organized, to help you to be able to plan out your hand every single time so that you're not making any serious errors and you're really putting yourself, in the best position that you can to succeed pre and post flop. But there is some fluidity within the system. And, with low to mid stakes poker games, you're probably supposed to be quite fluid. Like, you want to be quite exploitative. You want to pick up, information on your population, specific player, and then you want to exploit them as much as you can because it's very likely that they're not going to be able to counter that. They're not going to be able to exploit you exploiting them, if that makes sense. So this is a private 1-2 game. This was online. Loose passive player calls. Oh, that's not correct. Yeah, he calls, or limps, rather. And I would say he definitely errs on the side of being a little bit more of a station, but not like the biggest station in the world. I go ahead and pot it in position for simplicity. 10-9 of spades, 10-9 suited is going to be a little closer to the bottom of my range, but we are a little bit deeper. And this kind of hand, I'm going to have room post-flop to be able to bluff if I need to. I think when I'm deeper in position, I like to be a little bit wider, but I also like to have a lot of these hands that like high SPRs, like these drawing hands, whether it's like the middling pairs, suited connectors. I think it's a good situation to be in, especially when these two players in position, I didn't label them, but I would consider them a little more competent. They're going to respect my raise from the hijack a little bit more than what maybe a player like our villain would. So I do actually gain the button quite a bit of the time. Even if I don't, the hand will play pretty well multi-way, but I do think it's a good spot to try to isolate this bad player. One of the better scenarios that comes to fruition folds all the way to our villain who limps, and he decides to call, which is what a lot of them do. So step 2, stack to pot ratio. As I mentioned, pre-flop, we were going to be quite deep. I knew that the stack to pot ratio was going to be very high at this point, and that's why I like having a hand like this, because it does give me room to run multi-street bluffs if I need to. Against a lot of these guys, you can get them to fold one pair by the river, but this is kind of where we start talking about the in-game adjustment. And with these loose passive guys, especially if they are big-time calling stations, then we do want to take probably a more equity-driven approach and cut out some of the bluffs, really focus on value betting wider. As far as if we want to continue with the step-by-step system before we get more specifically into that thought. Step 3, range and polarity advantage. I am going to have both of those. Range advantage is easy. He limp called pre-flop. His range is going to be wider. It's going to be capped. It's just going to be weaker in general. Polarity advantage, meaning nutty combos. Yes, he could have some top set. He could have some middle set. He could have some top 2, maybe even bottom set. I have pretty much all of those combos, to be honest. But I'm also going to have more of the overpairs, more nutty flush draws. I'm just going to have the range and the polarity advantage at this point, which means I should be able to be quite aggressive in this spot. Step 4, though, and this is where we get back into adjusting in-game. Where am I at within my range? So, open-enders tend to be kind of middling. I've told you guys before, I like to break down my range into bottom third, middle third, and top third. When you're in the middle, if you're in doubt, it's probably not horrible to play the hand a little slower, do a little bit more checking back, or just check calling versus leads. These hands are going to be kind of middling. Now, I think, in theory, this hand would be bluffed quite a bit still. It has nutty equity if called. It blocks some of his continuing range as far as 9-8 suited, 10-8 suited, maybe 9-7 suited. Blocks the rarer pocket 10s or pocket 9s that some of these guys might limp call with. It also lacks showdown value. And the fact that his range is a little bit wider, you probably have some fold equity. You can definitely argue c-betting, planning to barrel a lot of the time. If I had a gutter, let's say I had 10 or Jack 10 suited, that hand probably is a C bet even more often just because it's a little bit lower in my range. Like it might be in that bottom third to where that hand has even less showdown value, perhaps, just less equity pushed overall. And so there is an argument that you would C bet that hand even more often than the open ender. Because against like a competent player, you would want to maybe be able to check back and show up with straights. So possibly show up with some open enders in your range. The adjustment in game, though, against the stations, against the more loose passive players, is like I said, you want to be a little more equity driven. So it can be argued that this hand is actually thrown in there more often than, say, a gutter, just because it's pushing a little more equity. However, I think with these guys, you can still do some checking back. And the reason for that is they're going to be pretty truthful on the turn when they're out of position. They're going to kind of let you know where you're at, and then you can take an even more confident line at that point. So it does check to me, and like I said, I think there's a serious argument for betting here, planning to use stack leverage, essentially, like, having very deep stacks here, being able to threaten his stack with his really wide range. I think that's definitely an argument. I would be totally fine with still c-betting here some of the time. But I decided to check back this time, and on the queen, he decides to check again. So let's think about his line for a second. Pre-flop, limp calls. Flop checks, turn, checks again. On the flop, he probably thinks that I would bet most of my good hands for value. So he has every opportunity here to possibly do some stabbing as a bluff. He's going to be able to value bet, get some protection for certain hands as well. But he decides to opt out of that aggressive line, and he decides to check again. So these guys, and especially the live low to mid stakes games, but even in like low stakes games online, they are going to be, quite unbalanced in the spot to where I think the best possible hand he has here is often like 7-6 suited. Maybe he has an 8 some of the time, but generally some of those pairs will bet for protection, thinking that I just have a hand like ace king or ace jack. He could think I have some ace queen, so he might check some of those pairs again. But in general, I think his range is quite capped here. I think he would have bet a queen or better at this point. So I felt very confident actually putting in an overbet. And you could argue that you could put in a smaller bet here, risk less. He is either going to still do some folding, or he might call, and then you can just blow him off of his range on the river with a barrel. However, if it's almost guaranteed that you're going to take down the pot right now with this bet, and it doesn't really matter what I represent at this point, a lot of these guys, you're not going to need to go to that level. All you need to understand is what his range looks like in relation to this board. And we know that he has worse than a queen, and we know that an overbet is probably going to fold out everything. So I would say, honestly, guys, out of like 100 times, this might get called maybe 2 or 3 times. It's going to work far more often than it needs to. So yeah, he does end up folding, and I think it's just an interesting hand where there's a lot going on. But I think the step-by-step system, again, it put me in place to be organized, to succeed, but I had some room within the system to stay fluid, to make adjustments if need be. My plan on the flop was to check and then possibly stab turn or barrel river if I could to get him off of his range. If I would have turned a 10 or a 9, I could put in a little value bet. If I turned the straight, could put in a value bet as well. I don't think I would balance that, though, with this sizing, just because I think he's too weak at that point. I think I very transparently to other players would go ahead and size down as an exploit to try to get some of the weaker hands in his range to continue. But overall, it's a good example of using the step-by-step system, being able to adjust. And, you're going to have some hands where you have possible lines that are, or multiple lines that are possibly very close in each other as far as how much money you can make, like the EV that you net. And you can use population reads, specific player reads to decide which line is best. I still am going back and forth in my mind on the flop whether I want to c-bet or check this hand. I really think it's very close, but once I do get the info I do on the turn here, I think it's a mandatory bet, and I think that you guys need to be willing to pull the trigger a little bit more often with these overbets, because you're going to find that these guys will not defend enough in those spots, and you'll just be printing money, making money with a lot of hands that you shouldn't even, like, even if I had air here, for example, I think I would bet almost all my air like this as well. If you get the feeling that your population or that specific player is picking up on that, Then you'll need to scale it back a little bit. You can't get so careless with just pure air here. You might want to stick to more like semi-bluffs, like gutters, some hands that maybe block the queen. Like if you did have air, I think like King Jack suited would be a pretty decent one. But you would want to balance that with a couple of value bets as well. So definitely an interesting hand. There's a lot going on here, guys. Just remember, if things start to get maybe a little overwhelming or a little complicated, just go through that step-by-step system. Make sure that your pre-flop range is sound, that you're putting yourself in a position to succeed post-flop. You'll have multiple ways to win if you usually do that. You'll be mostly playing in position with the initiative. And that's what I mean by having multiple ways to win. You either will be able to value bet, win the pot at showdown, or you'll be able to put yourself in a position where you can bluff certain opponents as well. But then steps 2 through 4, understanding how deep you are, what kind of hand plays well in that deep spot, range and polarity advantage, how likely are you going to be able to take down the pot with aggression. Step 4, where you're at within your range, deciding which third you're in, if you should be betting more often, if you should be checking back, planning to give up, if you've got really nothing, do you have a good bluffing candidate? Those 4 thoughts can all be used, like I said, over and over, each and every hand to help put yourself in a position to succeed and play better poker. So if you guys got any questions or comments, go ahead and let me know, of course, in the comments section. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.